Good evening, everybody. My name's Jan McVarish. I am the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. It's my very great pleasure and honour to welcome you all to this book launch tonight to celebrate the launch of Professor Stephen Greer's book, Falsely Accused of Islamophobia, My Struggle Against Academic Cancellation, which is on sale over there. I should say this is your chance to buy it at a substantially discounted price. like a lot of academic books or books by academics, it's usually slightly more. It's not cheap, but we're selling it for £30, which is a substantial reduction. So you can pay by card or cash. So do come and buy a copy, and I'm sure Stephen would be very happy to sign it before he runs off to catch his train. So the Free Speech Union is delighted to be co-hosting this event with Common Sense Society. I'll ask Emma Webb to come up and say a few words about that in a minute. And with the Oxford Institute for British Islam, about which you'll hear more later, with Dr. Hargey, who's going to be speaking tonight in conversation with Stephen. The number of warm messages that I've had from people who couldn't make it here tonight, I think is a testament to the significance of Stephen's case. And it's also, in particular, shows how much it resonates with academics. So we've invited an awful lot of academics who, given the time of year that this is, couldn't make it, unfortunately. But they've really sent their best wishes to Stephen and sort of would have really very much liked to be here. And I think that is because it's a story that lots of people feel like they are sort of one PowerPoint slide away from cancellation, or at least from a sort of initial stage of a disciplinary procedure if you're working within academia and also in other institutions. So Stephen's going to tell us much more about the experience that he's had shortly. I'll tell you something about Stephen first, though. He's an internationally renowned human rights scholar. I know my colleague Caroline Sallee said, "Oh, he's on our reading list. He's on our reading list, top of the reading list." And Caroline has been very closely involved in working with Stephen on his legal struggles. So he's an internationally renowned human rights scholar, and amongst other things, he is the research director of the Oxford Institute for British Islam. He's Professor Emeritus at the University of Bristol Law School, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He studied law at the University of Oxford and sociology at the LSE, and has a PhD in law from Queen's University Belfast. And Stephen's fascinating background is written in his first chapter, which is a really, really interesting read. So in a career spanning nearly 40 years, Professor Greer has taught and delivered numerous papers throughout the UK and abroad, including in China and at Harvard Law School. He's published widely, particularly in the fields of criminal justice, human rights, and law and terrorism. And 2 of his books were shortlisted for prestigious prizes. He's also acted as an advisor to various organisations, written for the Belfast Telegraph, the Irish Times, the Guardian, and the Times of London, and has appeared on numerous radio and TV stations in this country and abroad. However, the reason why we're here tonight is that in the academic year 2020 to 2021, Professor Greer was publicly and falsely accused of Islamophobia by the University of Bristol Islamic Society, BRISOC, which you'll hear a lot about this evening. Fortunately, in July 2021, an inquiry by the University of Bristol exonerated him without equivocation or reservation from all of these allegations. And in a moment, I'll ask Stephen to say more about this really horrific experience that he's been through for the last year or so. And this will then be followed by an interview with Dr. Hargey. He was born in Cape Town, South Africa. He's a historian and a theologian, and his academic interests embrace the Quran, African history, comparative religion, interfaith relations, and the Muslim diaspora in the West. A decade ago, Dr. Hargey launched the pioneering Open Mosque in South Africa, which champions ideological inclusivity, sectarian tolerance, and gender equity in an Islamic context. He currently directs the Muslim Educational Centre of Oxford, serves as the Imam of the Progressive Oxford Islamic Congregation, and recently became Provost of the Oxford Institute for British Islam, which you can see here, and I know he's got some literature about the Institute with him. This is a progressive Muslim think tank and research academy. Dr. Hargey's forward-looking and liberal perspectives on Islam are regularly featured in the British and global media, including the BBC and Al Jazeera. So there will be a Q&A following Dr. Hargey's interview with Professor Greer. And as I say, Stephen's books are available in the foyer over there, and there's more wine for you to stick around. We'll finish on time. We'll finish by 8:30, so Stephen can go and get his train back to Bristol. But we'll finish just a bit before that, so you can grab him for a signature, I suppose. We'll need to do that. And I'd like to just ask Emma Webb to come and just say a couple of words about the Common Sense Society.
So I just wanted to say very, very briefly, it's a real pleasure and honour to be hosting this first collaborative event the Common Sense Society has done with the Free Speech Union, which I was formerly employed by. When Patrick contacted me about Stephen's case and I first spoke to Stephen on the phone, I thought we had to do something about this because it's such a gross injustice. So this is a subject that is very dear to my heart. And so I just wanted to say on behalf of the Common Sense Society, it is a real pleasure and honour to be hosting both these eminent speakers. And thank you, Jan, for collaborating with us on this event. And I hope you will enjoy. I'll pass you over to Stephen and Dr. Hargey.
Well, many thanks indeed for those very generous remarks, Jan. There's a great deal of pleasure and honour going around the room tonight. It's a great pleasure and honour for me also to be launching my book here this evening. And this is especially so since there were times over the past couple of years when I doubted if I'd even live to tell the tale, let alone be able to do so at such an august venue and in the presence of such a distinguished audience. I'd therefore like to begin by offering my sincere thanks to the Oxford Institute for British Islam, the Free Speech Union and the Common Sense Society, which together have made it all possible. However, I should also like to take this opportunity to express my deepest and most heartfelt gratitude to my dear wife Susan and to my wonderful daughters Cara, Lucy and Hope and their families, who have suffered with and have supported me in this crisis. My ordeal began on the 15th of February 2021. It was then that I discovered that the University of Bristol Islamic Society, BRISOC, frustrated by the lack of progress with a formal complaint, had just launched a potentially life-threatening social media campaign against me based on nothing but lies, distortion and misrepresentation. The complaint, lodged the previous October, was not only manifestly vexatious and ill-founded, it had been submitted months after the specified deadline. The complainant, a medical student, had not been party to any of the events in question. Instead, he relied entirely upon rumour and hearsay from anonymous alleged third parties. He also refused to engage in mediation or conciliation, as the university's regulations require. The university also negotiated with BRISOC for 3.5 months before I was even informed of the charges against me, although I had found out through the grapevine that there was a complaint. BRISOC's complaint and campaign alleged multiple counts of Islamophobia in my teaching and other public output. An online petition demanding an apology to all Muslim students was soon signed by thousands and eventually by over 4,000. The campaign also attracted over 7,000 likes on various social media platforms. And if I refused to apologise, BRISOC called upon the university to discipline me, including by dismissal. They also insisted that the Islam, China and the Far East module on my Human Rights in Law, Politics and Society course, HRLPS, should be scrapped. And this was in spite of the fact that by this stage I taught both without significant alteration, difficulty or complaint, including to many Muslim students for nearly a decade and a half. BRISOC also falsely claimed that my alleged misconduct had been repeatedly drawn to the university's attention for many years, but nothing had been done about it. Yet apart from a mix-up about a quote from the Analects of Confucius, which some students mistakenly thought came from the Quran, we've since named this the Confucian confusion, BRISOC's complaint was the only one. Just over a week after the crisis broke, my wife and I were so unnerved by a suspicious incident outside our home the day Al Jazeera reported the controversy that I fled with her to stay somewhere safer a long way away for several days. For several weeks thereafter, I wore a disguise, not a very effective one, I have to add, but nevertheless I felt obliged to do it, every time I left the house, and also carried a stout umbrella and a screwdriver for my own protection. In July 2021, as Jan has just said, a University of Bristol inquiry exonerated me completely and without equivocation from all Brissoc's accusations, an outcome unanimously upheld on appeal that October. But meanwhile, the university prohibited me from telling anyone about this, except my immediate family, until it drafted a public statement with both me and Brissoc, which never in fact materialised. In September 2021, the law school removed the Islam, China and the Far East module from the HRLPS syllabus, expressly in order to avoid further complaints of the kind Brissoc had made, and to protect Muslim students from being othered. The Brissoc scandal was reported on the 12th of September 2021 by the Mail on Sunday with a very telling headline, "University clears Dawn of being anti-Islam but cancels his course anyway." In October 2021, the university publicly announced my exoneration, while at the same time stating that it recognised Brissoc's concerns. It also claimed that the HRLPS course had been altered in order to respect the sensitivities of those taking it. Now, these three developments, prohibiting me from announcing my exoneration, cancelling the module and the official statement, to constitute defiant repudiations by the University of Bristol of the outcome of its own inquiry. That can't be interpreted in any other way. They also, but worse than that, they also send a clear message that in spite of the assessor's verdict and my unequivocal exoneration, I may not have been entirely blameless after all. And that compounded the risk to my physical safety. Now, the university should have stopped Brissoc's campaign by disciplining the students involved, but it chose to do the opposite. Exhausted and demoralised by the whole experience, I was signed off work by my doctor from September 2021 to the beginning of January 2022. But early in 2022, my fortunes changed dramatically. In response to the Mail on Sunday report, I was appointed the first visiting research fellow and later research director at the Oxford Institute for British Islam, a newly established independent progressive Muslim think tank and research academy, about which Dr. Hargey will say something briefly at the end of our interview or conversation. By the time my fit note had expired on the 3rd of January 2022, I'd made a full recovery from the immediate damage to my mental health caused by the Brissoc scandal. But failing to tackle the toxic environment in the law school, my employer made it impossible for me to return to work on campus from January to September 22 when I retired. Several futile attempts were even made to stop me from working from home. Although I continued to receive my normal salary, my status for the last 9 months of my professional life was therefore far from clear. But not being a particularly avid gardener, I did not regard myself as being on gardening leave. Instead, I busied myself with several research projects derived from my association with OIBI, including my book. However, I couldn't physically return to work at the law school because the environment there was both toxic and potentially unsafe. For example, 2 societies the law school supports had signed Brissoc's petition to have me sacked without having bothered to check its veracity. And nothing's been done about that, in spite of the fact that I've drawn that to the attention of the law school. Now, my book is not, of course, intended to be an exercise in self-pity, whinging, or in seeking revenge. My wife can tell you I do plenty of that at home, or at least only the first 2 things at home anyway. If it were, it's unlikely anyone would be interested in reading it. Instead, it has the following principal objectives. I want to document my experience both in order to set the record straight, especially since there's been so much dissembling by the University of Bristol, and to provide a firm and clear evidential basis for my reflections upon it. I also want to name and shame the institutions and organisations responsible for the egregious injustice inflicted upon me, my family, and particularly upon academic freedom, in an attempt to hold them accountable, at least in the court of public opinion. I refer, of course, to BRISOC and the University of Bristol, the latter of which I regard as the real villain in this scandal. Ideally, I'd also like them each to receive a more official sanction, but maybe more about that later. In the book, I also consider the wider implications of my ordeal, in the hope, as I said, this might help protect others from suffering a similar fate, or at least offer some encouragement if they do. The book also seeks to demarcate responsible critical appraisal of Islam from prejudiced hostility towards it. Sadly, although I'm not aware of any comparable false charge of Islamophobia against a British academic, what has happened to me is otherwise far from unique. It is rather just another example of the rising tide of academic cancel culture and the corresponding lack of effective commitment to academic freedom on the part of many institutions in the tertiary sector throughout the English-speaking world and beyond, including the University of Bristol. Now, I was almost broken by BRISOC's campaign. They clearly intended to ruin my reputation, prematurely end my career, derive me of my livelihood, and ostracize me from my colleagues, all on the basis of lies, distortion, and misrepresentation. But they were also at best reckless about the risks the campaign posed to my emotional and psychological health, and at least indifferent to the possibility that it might have inspired a third party to carry out a possibly lethal physical attack. And we know, of course, this has happened to several people, not least Salman Rushdie and Sir David Amess, who had actually said very little that anybody could be regarded as offensive to Islam. Yet, the irony is, the delicious irony is, far from destroying or silencing me, the campaign has turned out to be a spectacular own goal, because ultimately it has provided fresh and even more credible platforms, not least my association with the OIBI, from which to disseminate the views BRISOC and their associates so wrongly regard as Islamophobic. Many total strangers who have since become treasured friends, many of them in the organisations represented here, by the way, have also rallied to my cause. So I look forward to answering any questions you may have once Taj and I have together further explored some of the issues my case and my book raise. The University of Bristol must own up to its wrongs and rectify them. If it fails to do so, it must suffer concrete adverse consequences. These might include being sanctioned by the Office for Students, the Charity Commission and the Department of Education, or losing significant donations from alumni and others. Now, I'm not sure if any of this is going to happen, but I think this is the direction in which the campaign involving my case and the contribution it makes to the wider campaign should proceed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Stephen, for that excellent background to your case. I think your case is a cause célèbre for our time. It needs to be dealt with, and we need to have a resolution to this. And I think you're very brave and bold and persistent to tackle the subject instead of just going into a hole and feel sorry for yourself. So congratulations on that, and for showing the way for all of us, to be fierce freedom fighters as far as liberty and free expression is concerned. So congratulations. Let's get to the number of the matter too. So you say BRISOC's campaign and complaint and campaign was mainly focused on your lecture, your seminar presentation on the Court of Human Rights, Law, Politics and Society, and a specific lecture on Islam, China and the Far East. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, well, over the course of my career, I've taught many human rights modules, courses, whatever, in various contexts. But the ones in the University of Bristol were, perhaps not surprisingly, very law-oriented. But as somebody who has a background in social science as well as law, it's always been my ambition to have to teach something that combines both, straddles both. And in 2005, I had the opportunity to construct a unit which I named Human Rights in Law, Politics and Society, which attempted to do just that. It was a social science unit, or I prefer to call it or a socio-legal unit, but I prefer to call it a platform for observing current global affairs through the prism of human rights, or vice versa. And of course, to get on the curriculum, it had to go through umpteen bureaucratic hurdles and approval processes. And it was thoroughly audited every year, not only by student appraisals, but by external examiners who universally appraised it. The students loved it. It was one of the most popular courses. We had a substantial minority of Muslim students on it. It was all going swimmingly well. And the people sometimes asked, why was Islam a topic on it? Well, the reason is it's less about Islam as religion and more about Islam as a contemporary political and social phenomenon. And the reason for that being is that with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet system, the debate of human rights was no longer way back then in the early 2000s, no longer about left and right, capitalism and socialism. It was about the West and the rest. And in the rest, who's in the rest? Well, in the rest, the main ideological constituents of the rest are political Islam, China and the Far East. Basically, that's what it is. However you want to label them, Asian values is one term that's a controversial term. So that's why it was on the curriculum. And all I did in the unit, as I hope somebody who's experienced academic and responsible academic, was to refer the students to the growing and the substantial literature on Islam and human rights, which the University of Bristol now no longer permits us to examine, which debates all the important questions. And some of it, at one end of the continuum, some of the literature says Islam and China Islam and human rights are compatible, but they need a little bit of kind of accommodation. The other end of the continuum, there are people who say they're utterly incompatible. That's basically all I did, and reviewed the literature, and that's Islamophobic.
But you say that you've been teaching this course for 15 odd years.
Yes.
And so how come there's been no complaints before that?
Well, the only other complaint was the confusion, as I say, where students who were either very inattentive or deliberately, maliciously motivated claim I read them out in the class. I read them extracts from the Quran and extracts from the Analects of Confucius, just to give them a sense of the flavour of these texts and how they're very, very different from kind of the rational Western secular tradition. And there's one particular one from the Analects of Confucius is quite amusing. It's about gentlemen bowing when they see a man carrying planks, for example. And there's a little footnote in the text that says planks may mean census tablets. So he thought, yeah, that's a lot more sensible. You bow to somebody carrying census tablets. So we got a bit of a laugh about that. But some of the students either literally thought that was from the Quran, or knew it wasn't from the Quran, but decided that they would accuse me of having laughed at the Quran. So I was accused of having laughed at the Quran. And that's a capital offence in many parts of the Muslim world. It can get you killed anywhere else. So there were no complaints. That was the only other complaint.
So why do you think that Bristol developed this sort of antipathy towards you?
There were two reasons. This is one of them's clear. They came after me because this is clear in their so-called evidence. Because I'm a vocal defender of the government's counter-terrorist prevent strategy, and which I deny is racist and Islamophobic. And their view is, if you believe it's racist and Islamophobic, you must be racist and Islamophobic yourself. Prevents racist and Islamophobic, denying that makes you racist and Islamophobic. Well, I dispute that wholeheartedly.
But that's the first reason.
The second thing is, it looks like, this is more speculative, it looks like they were trying to offer oblique support to another Bristol professor, David Miller, a sociologist, who was coming under pressure, who was being disciplined, in fact, for he was accused of anti-Semitism. He's an anti-Zionist, a self-confessed and visible and obvious, anti-Zionist conspiracy theorist. But he was accused of being anti-Semitic, and he was eventually sacked by the university for reasons have never been fully told, but it's ostensibly for professional misconduct. He wasn't sacked so much for what he said, apparently, but how he treated his students. So that's the long and the short of it. So those two things appear to be what motivated. I've reflected upon this a lot. Why did they come after me when they did? This all kicked off, as I say, in mid-February 2021. Just a month or two before the official prevent view was to take place, and just as the David Miller controversy was reaching its climax. So that seems to be a very, very obvious reason why it happened when
So
it
when
did.
BRISOC came after you, were you aware that there are over 150 Islamic societies at universities and tertiary establishments in the UK, and most, if not all of them, are Wahhabi, Salafi, and extremists and fundamentalists to some degree or not?
No, I wasn't, because I'd never really considered it. What hadn't interested me at all. I didn't really care about Bristol, about the student Islamic societies. I wasn't even aware that there was one at Bristol. But I mean, if I'd given it a bit of thought, I'd thought, well, yeah, probably is. So no.
So when they came after you, weren't you kind of concerned what was the intellectual drivers for them?
No, because I was too busy trying to defend myself from their accusations, and the inquiry into my case took 5 months, and it gathered 378 pages of evidence, many of which I provided myself. It was a huge strain, and not only that, but BRISOC had months, in fact even years, to lodge their complaint. But when they launched it, I had very, very little time to assemble my defence, because I knew the longer I took, the worse it would be for me, the longer the inquiry would take, and the more exposed I would be to harm. So I actually made my official response, detailed official response to their complaint in 10 days.
So
Yes.
now, with hindsight, what do you think are the reasons for BRISOC's complaint and campaign against you?
Well, I think it's the same. It's the same reason. But the other thing I'm thinking about now is I'm not one who's generally, favorably disposed towards conspiracy theories. I tend to believe more in the cock-up theory than the conspiracy theory. But there is something about this that suggests that there are, puppet masters behind this, pulling the strings, or there's something. We need. I think we need to find out. I think what your observation, Taj, is very spot on. How student Islamic societies work, who funds them, how they're connected. As you say, what the intellectual drivers are behind them, the political drivers are behind them. I am not in a position to say what that is, but I do know that they tend to be militant.
So didn't this your case actually prove the point that we need to discover who's funding all of these
Yes.
Islamic societies up and down the country,
Yes.
and where their allegiances are?
Yes.
And for example, at Oxford, you may know that I'm notorious for many reasons, but I've never been invited by the Oxford Islamic Society to come and talk to them, because they only want Pakka, Wahhabi, Salafi, fundamentalists to come and preach to them.
Yeah, sure.
And so this should be a wake-up call for all of us, I think, to investigate it. Because these are young, impressionable minds.
Yes, exactly.
And if we lose them,
Yes.
then we lose the whole community.
Exactly. This is true. This is so true. That's a very pertinent observation. Yes.
So what do you think, was BRISOC really aware of the fact that they are jumping onto this woke culture bandwagon and this academic cancellation thing, or was this just a sort of inevitable outcome of what they were gunning you about?
Well, I think there is a paradoxical connection between the militant far left, which dominates the social sciences, arts and humanities in most British universities, and student Islamic societies. The reason it's a paradox, of course, is student Islamic societies are very conservative, socially very conservative, and for the left to be promoting their cause doesn't make a lot of sense until you realise the reason the left is promoting their cause is because they make the assumption that if you're a minority, you must be being persecuted by the state.
But that's the Guardian line.
Well, I used to be a Guardian reader, but no longer. Or I used to read the Guardian reader. I used to read the Guardian, but was never a Guardian reader. You get my point. If you catch my drift, as the Americans say. Yes, I think that the case of the Guardian's a sad case. We'll maybe come to that later. But the point is, there is, and this has been observed in other places, it's a particular problem in France, this unholy alliance between the far left and the conservative Islam. It's very, very worrisome. But it ticks all, Brissoc's campaign ticks all the cancel culture boxes. And there's a whole chapter in my book about that, how all the elements of cancel culture, pretty much all the elements of cancel culture, are manifest in Brissoc's campaign. There's the refusal to engage in dialogue or debate about an issue. I mean, they actually literally expressly refused, even though the rules say if you've lodged a complaint, the first thing you do is you try and negotiate your way out of it. Refuse to do that. And you go straight for, they leapfrogged over all the informal complaints processes that law school has. About half a dozen avenues you're supposed to pursue first before you go to the university. Just ignored that. And they go straight for personal vilification and victimization. And on the basis of this binary view, good guys, bad guys, black and white, whatever it might be. And if you're on the wrong side of that, even though somebody like me is also an activist for social justice, but if your conception of social justice differs from theirs, you're the enemy, mate. You're not just an opponent. You're not just somebody who's on the same side but is thinking a little bit differently about it. You are the devil incarnate.
So what would Brissok say today? Even though that generation that was there probably graduated or whatever, but would they say they won and you've lost? Because what they did succeed, it makes you virtually invisible for the final year of your academic career.
Yeah, well, this is very, very curious. That's also riddled with paradox, because when the university, you can read it this both ways. It's a kind of draw in a sense. You know, neither of us really won, neither of us really lost. Because when the university did get around to announcing my exoneration, and that had been upheld upon appeal, Brissok went ballistic. They issued this very, very aggressive statement to the student press, saying, you know, the university had capitulated and so forth. The university capitulated to them, not to me. They don't even seem to realise that they got the unit, the module taken off the unit. So the other strange thing about this, and I was reflecting upon this with Susan just the other day, is that although they damaged my academic freedom, and although they damaged academic freedom generally, I have fought back and recovered it for myself. I was reflecting upon this, like I say earlier, even here this evening. And it may be said, let me just play devil's advocate. Somebody might say, well, look, Stephen, you were wrongly treated, but you still have freedom of expression. You've got a book published after all. You know, you can still say what you want to say, pretty much where you want to say it. And my attitude to that is, it's a bit like if somebody's punched in the face and falls to the ground and then gets up and punches their assailant, and you say, you shouldn't worry about the initial punch. You know, you got up, you carried on, you were able to carry on with your life. No, the fact is, the most enduring damage from this is self-censorship. It's not, you commended me, and I'm grateful to you for that, Taj, because I fought back. The only reason I was in a position to fight back was because my retirement was on the horizon, and they could not do anything, I believe, further to me that I wasn't willing to risk. And many other people are not in the same position. If this had happened to me 10 years before, I don't know what I would have done. I may have just issued the apology and gone along with taking it off the syllabus for easy life.
Now let's turn to the university.
Yeah.
In one word, how would you summarize their actions and attitude towards you?
Cowardice. Well, I can't really capture it in a single word.
Cowardice is a good start.
Acute,
What about pusillanimity?
Acute, craven, wokish cowardice, and a sense of self-preservation. If you ask, that was a very pertinent question. Why did they behave the way they did? Why did they do to me what they did to me? Given that I had given them 36 years of faithful and highly productive service. The reason was, and this is horrific when you reflect upon it, they preferred to put my life at risk rather than take the risk that somebody would call them Islamophobic. It's Islamophobia, basically. And it has gone that far that if somebody, there was an incident, like I said, outside our home, which it was, I'll not tell you too much about it. It was only suspicious because of the coincidence that happened on the day the Al Jazeera thing came out. But it was sufficient for us to be afraid that this could be a prelude to an attack. And you know, it wasn't a while when I did fear that I could be attacked. And luckily it was during, or luckily or unluckily, but it was during one of the lockdowns, and I didn't need to leave the house. I only went to get a paper out in the corner shop, which
Guardian.
no, I'd stopped reading the Guardian long before this. Whoops, stopped reading the Guardian long before this. Yes, so that's. I mean, that to me, I still find that utterly shocking. Not just because it happened to me, but because it happened to somebody. The university is so preoccupied with its own image and the implications of negative.
But what about the standard bearers of freedom on campus, the academics who do whatever they can to promote the academic freedom? Why were they collectively silent when you were attacked?
Well, fear and also cowardice, fear of physical repercussions, and also fear of, you know, if they would have stood up. Nobody came out. Let me give you a contrast. Some of my colleagues in the politics and sociology school mobilised, held public meetings to defend David Miller. Not a single person in the University of Bristol, in my own department, or anywhere in the academic community in Britain, nor in any of the human rights organisations to which I belong, or any of the other organisations to which I belong, including my union, raised a single whisper publicly to defend me. Now, I had a handful of emails, private emails from some colleagues saying, really sorry this has happened to you. None of them went public on it. And none of them have since come back. Following this, there was if you might be aware that my book received quite a lot of media attention. And none of them have come back to me ever since.
But Professor Greer,
yeah.
Sorry, if Muslims only constitute around 5% of the general public, the population of the United Kingdom at present, why would the University of Bristol, in your case, be so afraid and pusillanimous regarding this tiny minority?
Because this tiny minority is supported by a wider group of people, the far left, a certain there's kind of rings of support, if you like, or, you know, sort of different strengths of affiliation to this kind of cause. And there is a sort of, you know, it's well observed that wokeism has captured the public institutions in this country generally. And there's a whole debate, there's a literature on that.
Yeah, but if they accuse you of sexual harassment, that's maybe this is quite a different, you would have very little defense, so to speak, if you did something like that. But here we're talking about academic freedom.
Yes, I know.
Which is a bastion of all institutional learning.
It's shocking.
So why does the university not stand up for what it's supposed to be standing up for?
I don't know, except all I can say is that the explanation appears to be fear. And also that the theory that's the sort of, if you could call it an intellectual theory that's going on underneath this, is that oppressed minorities are so oppressed that in order to level the playing field, you've got to silence their oppressors, which includes people like me who are white, heteronormal, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what I am. You know, I'm one of the 75. Actually, I believe it's 74 genders. You know, I think one of those is a bogus gender, or maybe it's 76. But I'm one of them. We're all one of them, I suppose, or maybe we're several of them. So.
So I mean,
yes.
So the university administration. What about people, you know, high up who are big proponents of freedom of speech? Were they silent, or they just ignored the case, or they hoped it would go away?
Yes, they did. I mean, that's exactly what they did, and there's a kind of hysteria going on here, kind of what you might call a slow burn hysteria. It's not people out in the streets smashing windows like they are in Paris, for example, for other reasons, but it's a kind of just a slow burn hysteria that sees the ideological space, if you like, or the mentality of people who are in positions of power. And one thing kind of feeds off, each feed off one another. You know, to be seen to be behaving properly as a person in a public, particularly a public and private institutions as well, banks and all these other people, other places are succumbing to this as well. You've got to tick the boxes, and the boxes are you support minorities, but of course the support for minorities tends to be verbal support. These are nearly always exercises in virtue signalling. You say, so for them to say, we support Stephen Greer, we think what's happened at Bristol is appalling, would be a very bad mark, we would not be able to tick, I support the minorities box. And the fear would be on the part of these people who staff these institutions.
You describe very eloquently in your book about what Bristol University administration did.
Yes.
What would you like them to have done?
Well, as I said, number one, they should never seriously have entertained this complaint. It was vexatious and ill-founded. It was manifestly ill-founded. They could quite easily have sent it to an expert Islamic scholar like you, Taj, and you would have looked at it and said, that's just nonsense.
In fact, I did look at your PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
And aside from a few minor errors,
Yeah.
there was nothing substantive.
No. Well, nobody's perfect. But you could tell, you see, the thing about it is, BRISOC basically said, anything that's critical of Islam, even though it's universally accepted in the scholarly world, is Islamophobic. For example, we had a discussion about this yesterday in Oxford where Taj and I met. But it's well recognised by everybody who knows anything about the early history of Islam, that within a few decades after the death of the Prophet, a huge Muslim empire spanned a significant section of the globe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Himalayas. How did that happen? Through war and conquest. It wasn't because they went around, handing out leaflets, inviting people to convert to Islam. If you say that, I said that, and that is apparently Islamophobic.
Yeah, but that's not entirely true, Professor Greer. I mean, there are cases, I mentioned to you yesterday, but obviously it didn't resonate.
Well, you told me about the Egyptians. He said in the case...
Egyptians. So, okay, when Egypt was under the Byzantine rule and when the Arab armies came along there, the local population, in fact, this documentary evidence for this, they welcomed them as liberators.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can't make this blanket statement that everywhere Islam was spread by the sword, because just think about it. The moment I take the sword away from your throat, would you still believe?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
In other words, if you say Islam is spread by the sword, by conquest, by war, whatever. So when the force of threat is no longer there, the threat of force is no longer there, would the person still believe?
Well, several things I want to respond to that. Number one, even if you're liberating somebody in that way, you have to do it through violence. You have to do it through the sword. Even if we accept the case that what happened in Egypt was more of a liberation than a conquest, it still had to happen through military means. That's the first point. The second is that the empire didn't become fully Islamized until a lot later, and it's certainly not Islamophobic to make that observation. Whether we agree or disagree about whether the force was used for the purpose of liberation or the purpose of conquest is a subtle distinction, I would suggest to you. And we could use it. I mean, that's the argument the Russians are using today in Ukraine, and what Tony Blair and others that used in respect to the invasion.
Yeah, let's come really to. I mean, time is running out. Let's come to the elephant in the room, which is really anti-Muslim prejudice, bigotry, Islamophobia on one side, and fair, legitimate, rational criticism and critique of Islam and its followers on the other. Yeah. So, how do you view these two dichotomies? Well,
I think it's not Islamophobic if it's supported by a wealth of informed and educated and authoritative, particularly academic opinion. Certainly I knew that nothing that I was saying or presenting to the students could legitimately be accused of being Islamophobic, because it was all based on reputable sources. And as far as, there different debates to be had in the context of comedy, for example, and other different contexts. But certainly in the academic context, it's very difficult to make the case that something is Islamophobic if it's an observation that's almost universally made or almost universally made.
So do we have a no-go area in academia today?
Well, de facto, yeah, because one of the implications of what happened to me is that we'd have to be very brave at the University of Britain. You can no longer study Islam and human rights in that unit because it's been taken off the curriculum. It's been taken off the syllabus. That's a fact.
And what's the rationale for that?
That it's Islamophobic. That students don't like it. The Muslim students don't like it. They don't like it because it's Islamophobic, and because we're Islamophobia-phobic, we've got to take it off the syllabus. That's the logic, the logic that's going on here. So there is a de facto no-go area. Now, it's uneven, of course, because there are places in universities in the UK where you probably can say this more freely, and you're maybe more support from your employers. So there's an institute at Cardiff, for example, about British Islam, as you know, and but certainly anybody who's paid attention and is aware of my case would think twice about engaging in these debates, because you don't know where the tripwires are, or at least you do know where the tripwires are, and they're anything critical you say about Islam potentially exposes you to.
So what advice do you have for people, younger scholars and others, how to deal with this issue? Do we tread on eggshells? Do we tackle the bull by the horn? What do we do regarding this, I call it a no-go area as far as a fair and justified critique of Islam and its followers?
Well, this is where you come in, guys like you, people like you come in, Taj, because I think the primary responsibility for dealing with this developing crisis as far as Islam is concerned, and the wokish element in it, and the campaign that Bristock launched against me, is Muslims must take responsibility for it for themselves. I mean, we non-Muslims, me as a non-Muslim, other non-Muslims, can offer you our support, but the debate has got to be conducted, and the liberalisation of Islam in this country has got to be conducted and promoted primarily by Muslims, because that's the only credible place it can come from. If I say things about Islam, you've already corrected me, said I stand to be corrected on some of the finer points. Yes, of course, maybe on this I've learned a lot from you over our association the past year or so. It carries a lot less weight than if it comes from an eminent Quranic scholar like yourself.
Yeah, but when we have publications like The Guardian and the BBC and other organs like the BBC and others, that doesn't give groups like ours any credence or any attraction.
Well, you've just got to stand up and be counted, and there are enough. There's a growing reaction to this, and a counter-offensive, I could put it in those terms. And we've got the support of the Free Speech Union and the Common Sense Society and Alumni for Free Speech. There's a lot of people who are weighing in, and the National Secular Society and others, a lot of people who are weighing in on this debate, who see the gathering crisis for our culture and our education and our intellectual life and our social life, etc., 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 and who want to challenge and stem this tide of misfortune. So, what needs to happen is Muslims and non-Muslims need, and as far as we're debating here about my particular experience, Muslims and non-Muslims need to address this and need to affirm together the right to engage critically with any faith or ideology, particularly one that has implications for how people behave, how we're regulated and governed. The finer points of the faith, whether Muhammad really did ascend up to heaven from the rock in Jerusalem, that's of very little interest to me as a non-Muslim. But what I am, well,
and to me as well.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah. So what I am interested in is the debate we conduct about how we live properly and how we live well with each other, and how we establish institutions, norms, and procedures that enable us to do that. But unless we can have that debate, the whole project of a liberal society governed by the rule of law, etc., and democracy is in peril.
So after your hideous treatment by Bristock, what concrete suggestions do you have for us as a society to advance, firstly to maintain academic freedom and to advance it as well?
Well, I think again, as I said on the podium, the universities. Sadly, universities cannot be trusted to police themselves. That's one of the clearest things that's come out. I deeply regret that, because I do not. When I was a student, way back, nobody would even have dreamt that this crisis was on the horizon, because universities were capable of defending themselves and were capable of defending academic freedom. So they must be made to. How do you do that? Well, one of the most powerful ways, the University of Bristol has ignored all the overtures the Free Speech Society, Free Speech Union wrote to them. I've written to them. They've ignored everything since. They've stuck their heads in the sand. They hope it'll all just disappear and go away. The most effective way of inhibiting that is to get at their income streams. And you can do that in basically two ways. One is if they're officially sanctioned by an official body like the Office for Students or the Department for Education or the Charity Commission, that will harm their reputation sufficiently that could have implications for income streams. But the second is to alert alumni and donors to this gathering crisis so that they lose that source of income as well. And the reputational damage that can cause is huge. There was a chap who withdrew a donation of £400,000 to the University of Durham recently because of precisely this issue. And this was well reported and has massive impact. That needs to be capitalised upon and developed and enlarged. That's the way forward. Sadly, I think that's the only way forward. Otherwise, there's talk about, the other thing that universities love is codes of conduct, free speech officers, all of this kind of thing. The trouble is the landscape is littered with relevant norms, relevant duties and obligations. The problem is they're unenforceable. You can't enforce them unless this is another thing I've learned, that when you're wronged by somebody at a university like this, it's very, very difficult to bring them to book. You've either got to embark upon expensive and protracted and difficult litigation, or you've got to mobilise with other people. Luckily, there are people that, as I say, have come to my support and we can mobilise with. But even when these allies are drawn into the equation, drawn into battle, if you like, the university can still say, no, we're going to ignore you. You're nobody. We're just going to hold tight and wait until it all blows over. So we've got to try and find ways of, defeating that.
Thank you. One final question. So, is this the end of the Bristol saga, or is there part two?
Well, this is the end of the fourth phase of it. I think we're now entering the fifth phase. I'm not going through all what all the phases are, but the way I see it, there's been at least four phases of it now, and I'm hoping now that I can step back a little, because I've said pretty much everything that there is to say from my own experience and my own reflections upon it. It's now, I think, incumbent upon other people to use my case as an example of a broader and deeper and wider problem, and to take this forward, not for my sake. I mean, it's kind of over. The damage to me that's been done and is pretty much over, but the damage that's been done to academic freedom is very, very far from over, and it'll get worse unless something effective is done about it.
But shouldn't the university be monitoring student bodies like Bristol and others that actually infringe on academic freedom?
Yeah, I thought that was your last question.
Sorry.
Yes,
I couldn't help it.
They should, but they don't. This is the point. How do we get them? How do we make them do it? Somebody's got to step in and say, enough's enough. Unless you do this, you're going to suffer more than just reputational damage.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. That's really fascinating, actually. And if anybody's got any questions, okay, straight there, Khadija, Cora. So just to say, we are filming, but we're not filming. We're filming the conversation between Stephen and Taj, and we won't be including an audience in the edit. So if anybody's got any concerns.
I just want to say whatever happened to you, it's reprehensible. It shouldn't have never happened. But there are people who have been accused of Islamophobia for merely criticizing Islam. because they consider that Islam is a set of ideas that can be scrutinized, and anti-Muslim bigotry is entirely different thing. And people who seek to, who hurl around this accusation of Islamophobia, they seek to ring fence an ideology, and protecting individual has very little to do, with this whole thing. As an example, I would say recently BBC mentioned Ahmadiyya community as Muslims in a news piece, and a very mainstream Muslim organization, Cage, someone from that organization, they on Twitter, they said that the BBC or the other people, they should not call them Muslims because we don't consider them Muslims because they are infidels in their view. So this is anti-Muslim bigotry in my view, but nobody called him out, and there was no, noise and uproar like about anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia. So do you think that it is fair to say that, it's a question to both of you actually, it is fair to say that Islamophobia has become a synonym for blasphemy, and it is used to silence individuals who criticize ideas and who are not bigots?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a very pertinent question. I distinguish between Islamophobia, or what you might call anti-Muslim prejudice, which I think is real and palpable, but we don't know how widespread or how serious or where it occurs in our society. We just know that it does happen and people can suffer from it. That's a real thing. And then there's what some people have called Islamophobia, F-A-U-X, or faux Islamophobia, which is the false accusations of Islamophobia of the kind that I've experienced, which are precisely as you say, an attempt to silence somebody who's been mildly critical or who's raised some issues about Islam that the people making these false accusations don't like. And the third thing is, of course, we've touched on earlier, is Islamophobia phobia. And this is what I call a toxic trio. They each feed off one another. And false Islamophobia, I think, can actually drive real Islamophobia. Because, and this is one of the downsides of the BRISOC campaign, I think the more people who find out about this is one thing that I regret, and I think it's a very unfortunate feature of this whole thing. The more people who find out about this, the more it's going to fuel anti-Muslim prejudice, sadly. There was a rejoinder. That was the first part of your question. There was a rejoinder. Did you have another part of the question? Did you have your question was about, yes, I agreed with you, yes it is. Islamophobia can be just an attempt, the accusation of Islamophobia can be an attempt to silence critical engagement.
The accusation of blasphemy.
Yeah. Oh no, I know the other thing I was going to say. Yes, the Ahmadiyya case is a kind of very curious kind of paradox where Muslims themselves can be guilty of Islamophobia. So, yeah, it does something, it plays to your head, that kind of idea. But anyway, Tash, what do you think?
I think Islamophobia is a canard used by people to silence any critics of Islam. And I think we should actually delegitimize that word. I think the Muslims, like anyone else, should be held to account. And we should say things without fear or favor. And the truth must out. And I speak as a Muslim, and so if you come along to me and say, listen, this is something crazy, but you say Muhammad flew up to the sky, well, I don't actually believe that myself. This is just a crazy fundamentalist who believes that Muhammad got on a winged horse named Buraq and went up to meet God and stuff of that nature. And there's nothing in the Quran about it at all. So the thing is that we Muslims ourselves, okay, I can't speak for anyone else, but we have to say, listen, Islam should be subject to any form of criticism. And if it's not the truth, then it will collapse. If it's the truth, it will survive. And so that is my perception, that yes, level all the mud you want to do against me, Islam is spread by force and all of that stuff, I can handle that. And I'll show some deficiencies in that argument. But I think it's important that in a free liberal society, we should be at the forefront of freedom. And I want to invite all of you and those who are not here to our second conference of the OIBI, Oxford Institute for British Islam, at St. Anne's College, 18th to 20th of August. And the topic, the three-day conference is Islam, liberty, and free expression. In other words, we're taking the bull by the horns. And does Islam actually say there's no free expression, that it say that everything is blasphemous? And so this is a very important conference that will take forward this whole debate about freedom of speech, and especially in the Muslim context.
We're Free Speech Union are hosting an event here on the 13th of May in the big hall downstairs on blasphemy in all its contemporary forms, so kind of old and new. And my colleague Ben Jones, who's our Deputy Director of Cases, is that right, Joshua?
Yeah.
Is on panel, as is Stephen Evans from the National Secular Society and Emma Webb. We'll be reconvening on the 13th of May, and also Rakib Isan. So if you go to our website, you can get tickets for that. Right, who else? Fib, you had your hand up before.
Yeah, I was just, yes, I work at Spike, and maybe I'm being a bit pedantic here, but we get a lot of shutdowns by people pulling advertising or complaining, stop funding, he, whatever. And so I worry that if we spend any of our time fighting against this by calling out where they're being funded, we're missing a trick here, because really what we should be doing is ignoring them. Who cares? What's that going to help? That's not going to change the minds of people. What's going to change the minds of people is something really boring, which is what you were saying about your conference. That sounds excellent, which is just keep on banging the drum about free speech. No ifs, no buts. Free speech for your enemies, and keep on saying the values and ideals that we hold dearly. And it will get through, because it in the last 5-10 years, even though it's been quite depressing, it's also shown us that the majority of people actually probably with us. So we just need to be bold and brave and keep going. And doing something underhand with the finance stuff, it's a pedantic point, sorry. But I'm just, from somebody who has that experience, every week, every month, every year, we always get our money sucked away from us, and we have very little. I don't know if it will ever work.
Well, that's a very good point. That's a very sobering observation, and I'll certainly reflect upon it. But
But go from anyway.
Michael.
Yeah, just wanted to your case of parallels perhaps with Rachel Rosario.
Yeah.
Rosario.
Raquel
Rosario,
Rosario,
yes.
yes.
Who was also at Bristol, but it was transphobia that was her kind of blasphemy. And I just wondered if you wanted to draw any parallels with that case, and is there something peculiar about Bristol, or is it just these two cases are just still good coincidence?
Well, I'm not sure. It was just a coincidence. The differences between her case and mine are, she was a student, I'm staff, and there may be a difference. Her complaint actually led to her tormentor being disciplined. But get this, here's another example of wokishness on the part of University of Bristol. The person who was tormenting her and accusing her of being a transphobe claimed that the disciplinary process was damaging their mental health, so the disciplinary process was wound down. The disciplinary process didn't lead to any disciplining because it damaged their mental health. Now, this is just the kind of the way the oppressors turn themselves into the victims, and they get off the hook. So therefore, Raquel took her case to the High Court and lost, because they held that the judge held that the fact that this is a huge failure of the judicial reasoning as well. Of course, I think the judge held that because her tormentor had been referred to a disciplinary process, the university had discharged its duty of care. What the judge should have thought of as, was the disciplinary process effective enough to have discharged duty of care? Not that there was, in fact, just a disciplinary process. And that's a feature of this whole landscape. If a lot of people think if you've got a bureaucratic process that's in place, that's all right. You don't need to consider whether it's effective or not. What I'm saying is a lot of these bureaucratic processes are just stacks of cards. They're flimsy. They're fragile. They're not effective. What you need is effective processes.
Right, I'll just take another one here, and then we'll go over that side.
When the complaint was made against you, was it a case of misapplying this nebulous label Islamophobia to things that weren't in fact in any way reprehensible, but just had a forced labour applied to them that was provocative? Or were there factual statements made about you which, had they been true, would have merited some criticism of you?
No, nothing that I had said, either verbally or in the literature to which I'd refer them, or on the PowerPoint slides in the lecture, was remotely Islamophobic.
Did they say false? They make false accusations.
Yes, they did, of course. Yes. They said there were lies.
Yes.
The lies.
Had they been true, would they have merited some sanction?
Possibly, let me tell you what the lies were.
Yeah.
One lie was that I denied there's such a thing as Islamophobia, when in fact I have a blog on the University of Bristol Law School's blog site entitled "Know Your Enemy: Racism and Islamophobia," which tries to say that Islamophobia is not a species of racism, but they're both social prejudices and they're of damaging effects and so on and so forth. They also said, and this is one of the things that got me into a lot of trouble, they also said that I had characterized the Chinese repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in western China as merely superficially discriminatory. And what they'd done there was they'd elided two statements I'd made. One, I'd said the PREVENT program in the UK looked as if it was Islamophobic. It was only superficially discriminatory. If you drilled down, you'd find that it's not discriminatory. With exactly the opposite I've said about the Chinese, because in the lecture on the Chinese human rights record, I said there've been some positives since the end of the Second World War in the Chinese human rights record. One of the most important ones is that something like 300 million people have been taken out of poverty. That's well recognized in the literature. But I also said one of the negatives was the way the Chinese were mistreating the Uyghurs. So that was a blatant lie. So there were others, but the rest was just this guy's reported something from the authoritative literature that we don't like. It says something negative about Islam, therefore it's Islamophobic. I took some quotes from texts on the Quran, for example, which described the Quran as being non-chronological and elliptic and delivered in a language that was the message was already familiar to its audience. Therefore, it was the style was elliptical and elusive. That's Islamophobic. Now I took that directly from a book, a reputable book about the Quran. So it was all like that.
Well, make one very brief for all. You could sue the people involved.
Yes, and
you could get damages and costs against them. You
well,
could bankrupt. You could ruin their lives.
the limitation.
I'm not joking. This is what I do for a living.
Bristol,
Money.
I'm not after money. I'm not really after destroying people either, to be honest. I mean, what I want is just the university. I regard the university as being the real villain in this because Bristocks were just a bunch of silly students, with a malicious intent, okay. But they could have been, the whole campaign, the social media campaign could have been nipped in the bud because they actually alerted the university to the fact they were going to launch it. And the university had an optimal opportunity to say, you do that, mate, and you'll be facing a disciplinary inquiry. They didn't do that. The university just let it go ahead. Even if when it went ahead, the university didn't try to stop it by threatening the students involved. I think I've missed the time limit for the
3 years and 10 months.
for 3:21 for okay.
You still have time.
Well,
Snapchat
the whole question of litigation has been explored, and I'm not 100% persuaded to go ahead with it for all kinds of reasons. But I know that's a cudgel you can wield in this context, but it's not one that's necessarily guaranteed to have the effect that you want.
Okay, let's. Yes, Gary. No.
Professor Greer, thinking about the solutions to the problem, they have set a quick scenario and then you can comment on that. I don't personally have a problem, finish this, with rapists, murderers, drug addicts. Why? Because I recognise in the human condition that there are wicked people. As long as the police are acting on our behalf to capture and stop these people, that's great. What really frightens me is if the police go to the villain's side. So my question is this. Is the real problem a militant version of Islam that's threatening people with violence and therefore shutting them up? Or is the real problem, tell that by tone, the leftist capture of institutions that weaponize an imaginary victimhood for their own benefit. And that's what we should be tackling. Not so much talking about Islam. If we solve the problem of leftist capture, then the other side will follow.
I think that is a fundamental problem. And I mean, keeping the what your remarks about the police out of the equation, it's certainly very, very visible about the University of Bristol. That's exactly what they've done. You know, they've just kowtowed to a bunch of students who were not in any sense victimized. Let me tell you, some of them claimed that being exposed to the literature that's about the relationship between Islam and human rights drove them to suicidal thoughts. What? And so I'm saying to them, did you have to leave your home? You know, early one.
Didn't you give them a trigger warning?
Yeah, well, no, I don't believe in those. Did you have to leave your home because you were afraid somebody was going to chop your head off when you come out of it the next day? No, of course I didn't. But that's how risible it's become. You offend me. You say something that I don't like. I'm not just offended. I'm having suicidal ideations, and therefore, if I top myself, that's your fault. And institutions capitulate. That's exactly what happened in Raquel Rosario's case. The disciplinary process was making the bully have mental health problems. Okay, we better back off. They get away with it. Yes, you're right.
I'd like to pick up on the previous topic of litigation, if you don't mind. I'm sympathetic to your view that the university itself failed in terms of acting as a neutral, independent arbiter of this dispute, and that they should have quashed the complaint much earlier in the process. That said, ultimately it was the lies of Brissock that took you to where you ended up. If they are not held to account, they will do it again. If other agitation groups on student campuses are see this happening, they will be emboldened to do it again. So I would really like to add my voice of encouragement to you to reconsider the possibility of litigation. I wouldn't pretend to know what advice you've received on that, but there are many August defamation lawyers that are around that these groups can put you in touch with to have these conversations, to entertain the possibility of pursuing that. But I would certainly like to encourage you to do so.
I endorse that.
It's not defamation, it's conspiracy.
Yes, I think yes, it is. Yes, I mean, there's all kinds of heads of damage. I think the strongest one is probably breach of duty of care in my case, because the university not only failed to protect me from Brissock's threat, they actually compounded the risk to my safety. But there, as I say, there's more than one way to skin a cat.
You have time.
Yes.
Yes, at the front.
When you were talking earlier about why so many people in the academic freedom world within the universities didn't do anything, you pointed to this idea that these sort of sacralized minority groups are seen to be in a position where when someone criticizes them, they don't have the ordinary rights of freedom of speech because of this sort of power dynamic almost. It struck me this isn't a new idea. This goes back to Marcuse and the idea of repressive tolerance. This is now pretty widely disseminated through the university system. How do we fight people who believe that there is no such thing as free speech? Because the power dynamic is such that it's sort of like one person trying to say something whilst a crowd shouts back. So I'm with you. I think we should have genuine freedom of speech, but how do we answer those people?
By giving them a voice too, by saying we've all got the right to make a contribution to this debate, and it's not a question of who shouts loudest that gets heard. But the trouble, I mean, that's hugely, like, maybe naive or optimistic. The problem is that social media has negated that, because in social media it is about who shouts loudest gets heard. And the challenge is, I mean, universities should be a space that's not afflicted by that. But of course, they're not hermetically sealed. The people at universities are themselves on social media. And this whole crisis began way, way back. There were precursors to it. It probably began in 2018 when a colleague and I were denounced on social media by some colleagues at another institution, Birkbeck College, that happens, for being Islamophobic and racist because we denied that Prevent was Islamophobic and racist. That's when it all kicked off. And that was then was starting to do the rounds, and it was germinating and it was circulating and so forth for a couple of years. And then BRISOC, 2 years later, BRISOC lodged the complaint. A few months later, they have the social media campaign, and so it goes on. I mean, we just get back to what Taj and other people said, that universities, the way forward is for universities just to be required, effectively required, to have a more level playing field on their own turf. You know, they can't really. There are rules about how universities have rules about how their students and others behave on social media, which are also very ineffective, of course. But they should at least have effective rules about what is said in the classroom and in the formal educational context, and try and ensure that within that context there is a more level playing field and freedom of speech is protected.
Well, where does the Department of Education fit in though? What's incumbent upon them to resolve this whole issue? Sorry, I've just not even put my hand up. I'm so sorry, that's so rude. But it just seems that they commentate. They don't seem to, as far as I'm aware, they're responsible for education.
Well, this is what I think.
As I said, where is the burden of expectation upon them and our political friends?
Okay, well, let's hear from Stephen.
Yeah, I've got related questions to that really. I'm interested in the role of the Office of Students. So a House of Lords inquiry into the effectiveness of the Office of Students as a regulator is closed today. You please hear replaying the submission. But the Bristol are registered with the Office of Students, and as part of their conditions of registration is to uphold academic freedom. So I'm just interested in your role, your take on the role of the OFS.
Yeah, William's maybe got a contribution.
Can I add a riff on that? Which is, there's a new legislation coming through which is going to up their responsibilities, it's going to up their powers.
They still have those powers.
They do, they're just going to be a bit stronger. It's going to bring this new director of free speech, who, if the right person gets appointed, is going to be really quite active. Yes. They're making much stronger noises. At the end of last year, they came out with a very good, sort of quite long statement about it all. And if I'm quite encouraged by that. Am I naive? Is the question?
I don't know. I think the key institution here is the Office for Students, less so the Department of Education, because if any complaint you bring to the Department for Education about this kind of thing, they'll just say that's an Office for Students responsibility. That's what we've set it up for. It's not for us to take control of that ourselves. The Office for Students, and William, as you've said, it's not just a question of the rules and the guidelines, the bureaucracy. It's a question of the leadership and the will to enforce them. And of course, part of the issue here is that anybody in that post who's going to take on a university is going to land themselves in a huge amount of trouble, because it's going to be a huge bloody fist fight, because universities are going to mobilise against it. They will not want to be reprimanded by the Office for Students, and unless there's somebody who's willing to take them on, it's all going to flop and fail. But I mean, the front runner for this, is somebody I think who can be trusted to do that, and I hope he does get appointed.
Any final question? Hargey. Sorry, I'll do the second.
First, Greer, I want to thank you for your courage and imbuing that in the audience, and I'm sure your example will help others stand up in the future. I was very curious around the one point of contention you had with one another, yourself and Dr. Hargey. It was around conquest. So the point that the discussion around, and it's something quite relevant because it's something that's defined in the Islamophobia APPG definition. So they say that images or tropes characterising Muslims spreading Islam by the sword and subjugating minority groups under their rule is Islamophobic according to this APPG, and equated to racism, therefore, because that definition was equating Islamophobia to racism, a type of racism, which targets expressions of hostility towards a Muslimness or perceived Muslimness or something like that. It's not verbatim, sorry. I was wondering what role that definition had in the complaint against you, if any, And if you feel that the people behind these malicious people were emboldened by the fact that this definition had been put in place, despite being rejected by the government, was adopted by many political parties, as well as being adopted now across councils up and down this country and in Scotland and Wales. Did it have a role in your complaint? And do you think it kind of was part of those triggers for these people to become so emboldened to complain about you?
Well, I agree with what you said about the PPG's definition. It's riddled with problems. That's the first thing. But the second thing is it played a very paradoxical role because BRISOC cited it in order to repudiate it. They both cited it to support their case and then said it's hopeless anyway. I mean, that's the illogicalities of this whole thing are just almost infinite. They just go on and on and on. And one of the things that just comes out is just so how there's such a deficit of thinking. These people cannot think or will not think. The other thing they did, the evidence. The other thing they did was they actually published their so-called evidence on a website, and the evidence was just, here's all the things he said, or we think he's said, that's Islamophobic. There was no attempt to make a case, to argue a case, to set out what is Islamophobic, to say why a particular statement is not just offensive or unacceptable, if it is, but why it's Islamophobic. So that's just where we're at. But if we're going to finish off, and one thing I'd like to do just before we do is to invite Tash to say a little bit about the Oxford Institute for British Islam. There are these brochures outside for you to help yourself to. But amongst the many people in this audience, Patrick Nash is one of my other very, very vociferous supporters, and Caroline and some of the others. Taj has been one of my, he came to my rescue basically, Taj. I mean, Taj may well have saved my life, literally as well as metaphorically. So if you could tell us a little bit about the Oxford Institute, Taj, before we go back to the drinks.
Yeah.
He's not allowed to drink because it's Ramadan.
Yes,
but the sun's gone down.
Don't worry about that.
He doesn't drink alcohol anymore.
Yeah. Anyway, but just very briefly, I would like all of you to take a copy of this. There's a few extra ones out there. It tells you the reasons and the motivation behind this Institute for British Islam. And when we talk about British Islam, I want an Islam. I myself, I'm an immigrant here many years ago, but I want an Islam that belongs here. Not in Saudi Arabia, not in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. An Islam that is indigenous, so to speak. Christianity took 500-600 years to become indigenous. We don't have 500-600 years. We have 5-6 decades. And we have to expedite this process. And so I want to have an Islam that is totally integrated, inclusive, and indigenous to this society so that your children and grandchildren will be able to live with my children and grandchildren without fearing one another. And we won't have bombs like in Manchester and the London Tube and everywhere else. If we do not take the bull by the horns and deal with BRISOC and all of these fundamentalists at universities and so forth, what future is there for us? There's none for me, by the way, okay, because they'll target me first, okay? But collectively, there's no future for us unless we can slay this dragon. Mm-hmm. And the way to slay this dragon is by intellectual means, okay? Blair's not my favorite politician, but when he came in, he said, education, education, education. I will change and say theology, theology, theology. Without understanding Islamic theology, you cannot defeat these fanatics and fundamentalists. And so it's incumbent on all of us, if we really want to have a more peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, fraternal society, for us to understand what drives Muslims and then to poke holes in the arguments. And that's why I'm quite happy to have a fierce debate regarding Islam. And if there's criticism, I'm happy to take it on the chin. And if I can answer it, I will answer it. If I can't, I'll yield to the superior perspective. But this institute is a pioneering think tank that will need the support of people like you, because we're not getting a lot of support from Muslims. Now, there are 5 million Muslims in this country, more or less. If we can get 1%, my math is not very good, but 1% is about 50,000 people, that is a huge, significant body, because who will be attracting are the movers and shakers, not the people working in supermarkets and driving taxis. Nothing wrong with that, but the people who are creating who are professionals and and have achieved something. And so if I can get 50,000, forget 50,000, 5,000 thinking Muslims like that, we will be a huge force and presence in this society. But we cannot do this without non-Muslims. It's impossible. And so my humble plea for you guys to come to our important conference in August at Oxford University. It's never been done, as far as I'm aware, Islam and free speech. I mean, normally it's like a misnomer. Normally it's like a misnomer. But just very briefly, the Quran says, to you, your religion, to me, my religion. It says elsewhere, whoever wishes to believe, let him believe. Whoever wishes to believe, let him disbelieve. And then it says, there's no compulsion in religion. So there's a whole bunch of, Quranic verses that talks about freedom. But it is this blasphemy stuff, the stuff that comes from the sort of post-Muhammadan period. I call it the toxic trio, the hadith, which are the reputed sayings of Muhammad, the Sharia, which is the concocted version of medieval opinion, and the fatwas, which is sadly Salman Rushdie is one of the prime victims of that. When we have this toxic trio molding and shaping Islamic theology, and most people, Muslims themselves, are not aware of it, and non-Muslims are totally in dark about it, that is why these fanatic fundamentalist priests and ayatollahs thrive and survive. So please support us. This is not only in my interest, it's in our interest. And we got to, and this issue of free speech, the Free Speech Union, the Common Sense Society, and all of this stuff, we are all fighting the same fight.
Yeah.
And we need to band together and come together. And that's the only way we can make a tangible difference to our society. So please, before you go, grab one of these and read it on the tube.
Thank you. Here.
I think it means an awful lot to fill a room the night before the Easter holidays and just to show your support for Stephen, which I think is such an important thing to do. You haven't got a whole gang of feminists behind you, like a lot of the women academics who've spoken out. So I think, I don't know what that looks like if you start to have sort of a gang of supporters. But I think that, this is the start of something, so it's excellent. Thanks very much.